Welcome back to Arise News Hour. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, just over a year ago, hundreds of people died when Burundians took to the streets to protest against President Pierre Nkurunziza's third-term bid. But now a commission in the Central African nation says the majority of the people don't want presidential term limits. The Inter-Burundi Dialogue Commission's report will now be considered by Parliament, with a real possibility that the constitution may be amended. Aniagolu looks back at the political crisis in the country.
When Burundi's president Pierre Nkurunziza put his name forward for another term in 2015, the Great Lakes country descended into chaos and violent protests. A section of the army attempted a coup and failed. The opposition argued that Nkurunziza was in breach of the Arusha Agreement that ended a bitter civil war, as well as the country's constitution, in seeking another mandate as president. In the end, he went on to stand amid a violent crackdown and prevailed. It's the new commission that he set up to canvass public opinion that now says the people of Burundi are not in favor of presidential limits after all. But critics say the presidential commission cannot be relied upon. They doubt its independence. Some believe in the event of a referendum that too would not be free, fair, or credible. Both the citizens of Burundi and the international community want to avoid a repeat of the ethnic civil war that left more than 300,000 people dead and millions displaced. Nkurunziza is resisting the deployment of foreign or UN peacekeepers in Bujumbura. In the event that there is a referendum, the East African regional leaders would be the first respondents. That includes Rwanda, Uganda, the two countries that have already abolished term limits. With South Sudan, Somalia, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Ethiopia facing political crisis, it may be left to Kenya and Tanzania to make the dissenting case. Aniagolu, Arise News.
Well, joining me now to discuss this story in more detail is our correspondent Aniagolu, who you heard on that report, and of course the African affairs analyst and something of an expert on the Central African region, James Woods. Thanks to both of you for coming in. James, I'll start with you. How much have you been taken aback by this development? Was it unexpected for you?
I would say I like to be surprised by it, but bearing in mind what's going on in Burundi, I would say that most of us wouldn't be surprised with such antics taking place. The report itself, reading it, actually broke yesterday, so I managed to get hold of it this morning. Reading through it, first of all, I questioned how legitimate this commission is. Because number one, we already know that the head of state called for a third term against the Arusha Agreement, against the Constitution, citing Article 96 in the Constitution, saying that he had to be elected by universal suffrage. But he was elected through the parliamentarians, so he managed to utilize that to seek a third term. So you can see that he's already got a lot of sway and political influence in getting decisions his way. So with this commission that is being set up under him, you look at it that, are they really operating in the essence of the population, or is this something that he's doing for his own interests?
On the other hand, of course, President Nkurunziza goes to the polls asking for a third term, wins the election, then he sets up a commission which concludes that people are happy for him to continue as president indefinitely. Surely that is democracy in action.
I would say that's not democracy in action. First of all, the keystone of democracy is, number one, the collective, individual and collective rights. People should have a choice. Unfortunately, what we see in countries like Burundi and some of the neighboring countries, you find that a lot of the voting comes from the rural areas where people undergo suppression. It's also through to, I say, political influence in those areas. Ethnicity plays a very big role. So to say that this is the people's choice is very questionable. And number two, I said the commission itself, we have to look at the legitimacy of this commission.
Well, let's bring in our correspondent there, Aniagolu, who's been following developments there. Is it likely that Parliament will acquiesce to this, what opponents are calling this travesty of democracy?
Given that the party of the president has a majority in Parliament, and also given the inclination, the tribal votes with the Hutus being the majority in there, it is highly unlikely to see the proposal falling off, or even in a referendum should it come to that. But also the feeling in the country that the crackdown continues. Just before we came on air, we got reports that the police are making more arrests of people who are using WhatsApp just to communicate. And the people on the ground are saying that is evidence that these cyber laws will now be used to stop people organizing to protest against this. So it is likely that if it comes to a referendum, it will pass.
So, James, given all that we've just heard, is the snake of insurrection likely to rear its head again in Burundi? And if so, how deadly will its sting be?
Well, number one is that when we look at a country like Burundi that is being plagued by conflict, this conflict has actually come through the ethnicity aspect of it, the Hutus and the Tutsis. So if you do this, number one is, as my colleague has said, is that the Hutus are in control in terms of the population. We already know that once they get that aspect, once they get the commission saying that they can run indefinitely, it will be still Hutus promoting Hutus.
Right.
Tutsis still being undermined.
So based on that, Tam, the suggestion there is that to some extent this violates the ethnic Hutu and Tutsi power sharing, I don't know, unspoken agreement, and that potentially that could be a very dangerous situation indeed.
Right. If we take some pictures from the Civil War, that was before then. That is what brought the Arusha Agreement. The agreement in the main is holding, because what it spoke about was the distribution of posts within the army, and we saw that throughout this conflict or problems or instability politically, there was no ethnic dimension, which probably saved Burundi to a large extent. So President Nkurunziza will be extending an arm to try and win political support from the Tutsi minority populations to avoid a big problem. But where the biggest problem is within the region. Yoweri Museveni in Uganda is a beneficiary of the change of the constitution in abolishing this. Recently, President Kagame in Rwanda. And what you then have is, in general, a lot of African leaders saying to the West, well, in Britain you don't have term limits. In most of these countries, there are no term limits because they use the...
So that's a very good point. Let me just get your response to that before we have to go. That whole region, as is pointing out, of Africa seems to be afflicted with the presidential entrenchment bug. I mean, DRC, Rwanda, Uganda, seeking to extend their stay in office by, constitutional stipulation.
I think that is very worrying, because number one, within that area, we're looking at the East African Community, which is the body that should be governing when this is taking place. And unfortunately, the main members in there have all tried to extend their constitution to allow them to stay longer. So that is very worrying. So which also brings the worrying aspect that the East African Commission may just collapse. It doesn't seem to be of any benefit at the moment. Within the African Union, we've also got many of the member states that are also looking at abolishing the term limits. So it does bring that general worry. But as he's rightfully said, this is a narrative that is generally growing within Africa, that if you have talents as a leader, these talents shouldn't be limited. But what we need to look for, leadership is about inclusivity. Leadership is about actually creating the next generation of leaders. So it's right to serve your mandated term whilst you're also nurturing the next leaders to take over, to grab the mantle from you and continue in good governance. So we hope that institutions like the Mo Ibrahim Foundation that promote good governance can also be something that will encourage these leaders to hand over the mantle.
Okay, James and Tam, thank you very much indeed.